Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the plenary session, which is going to be a panel discussion on a very, very important and interesting topic, engaging with the private sector, a dialogue among multidisciplinary researchers to navigate the contested space. Professor Srinath Reddy is going to chair this session. There's no better person to chair this session. I request him to start the panel discussion.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to chair, so the first thing I have to do is to abandon my chair and let this brilliant panel handle it all. Clearly, we have a very challenging topic in front of us. The whole area of how researchers will engage with the private sector in a manner that is productive, but is also protected from different transgressions in terms of ethics and conduct. Firstly, how do researchers engage, and why do they engage in the first place? And why does private sector want to fund research in any case? For that, I think we'll have to really look at, firstly, the private sector motivations as a funder. Obviously, they would like to devise and develop products and to drive markets. And why do researchers engage? Because of the funding opportunities that exist, and particularly because the public sector funding may be scarce or restricted, and also because there could be common areas of research interests which requires them to engage with the private sector, which is a very large player across the whole value chain. And thirdly, there could also be complementary strengths that they could draw upon for multidisciplinary research, where the private sector may have embedded within it technical and managerial expertise, which may be necessary to answer certain types of research questions. Of course, the big question always comes in is the private sector the preferred funder? Or is it because of a necessity created by public sector disengagement and apathy? So is it sparse and select funding from the public sector? And that again sparks a question, how can public sector funding be enhanced? And also whether the public sector and the private sector can jointly partake in funding of important research through what are conventionally called public-private partnerships. And even if the private sector is the predominant or sole funder, what is the public policy on private sector funding, and how does it actually ensure that public policy priorities are informed but not unduly influenced by private sector funding? So these are some of the questions that do come up, recognizing, of course, that the private sector is very heterogeneous. It is not a homogeneous entity, so there are different segments who may behave differently. There are different segments with different areas of research priorities. So how do the researchers engage with these different groups? And how do you choose or refuse? That is another question that would come up. And then, when actually private sector funding takes place, is the public policy wary of the information generated? Should it be wary? Or should it filter it through some very clear-cut processes? Then comes the nature of the engagement itself. What are the safeguards that are needed? How do researchers draw the boundaries in the selection of research themes, in the conduct of research, in the management of data, in shared co-authorship if the private sector is also participating in the research? How do they ensure honest reporting of results without bias? Then there are perception challenges. Are there perception challenges among policymakers, scientific journals, media, and public? How do you ensure that these will not affect either the integrity of the research results or its applicability. Then the other element is researchers also often study industry behavior itself. That itself is an area for research. So when researchers are actually taking funding from the private sector, how can they study also industry behavior, particularly when regulatory behavior response to regulations are concerned? The whole area is now quite open to industry behavior change. Is the industry behavior proactive, trying to develop healthier products? Or is the industry behavior preemptive, trying to prevent litigation and further regulation? Is it cooperative or co-opting? So some of these questions do come up, and they need to be answered if the research enterprise has to progress. And another sensitive issue could be if a researcher is receiving funding from the private sector, but there is a different piece of research being carried out by the same funder, but by a different researcher. Will the researcher who has received funding for another project be objective enough to comment candidly on the results or the implications of the other project? Or will the researcher be inhibited by the fact that he or she too has been a beneficiary? So there are multiple questions that come up. Some of them are complex, but fortunately to deal with this complexity, we have a stellar panel of people whose experience and expertise are immense in many of these areas. So it's my job to draw upon their wit and wisdom in order to try and reflect on these ideas. And I have in my panel Inge Brouwer, Simone Barquera, Jan Lo, and we have Francis Zotor. And I now leave you in the hands of the panel. We'll begin each with an opening statement and then have some reflections on the remarks made by the other panelists before we open it up to the audience Q&A. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm reacting on you with a head up with two sides. One side is I'm from Wageningen University, and as most of you know, it's quite liberal in collaboration with private sector. And the other side of the hat is I'm leader of the Food Systems for Healthier Diets, a flagship within A4H. And I would like to mention 3 points that, in my opinion, are challenges in working with private sector. The first point is what is at stake is the credibility of science, and we should be very serious on that. Because if people don't believe in science anymore, we better stop with doing science. So we should be serious handling credibility. And in working with private sector, there is the fear that close collaboration with private sector will let the private sector influence results and conclusions of studies. And that's not in the form that there is an angry CEO with a red pen that is striking out conclusions or changing your sentences, but it's more subtle, influencing research questions, influencing designs. I'm actually not so worried about that because there have been quite a lot of discussions on it. There are excellent code of conduct, also in the Netherlands by the Royal Academy of Science. You have to sign Declaration of Independence. There is always open access policy. Everything will be published in open access sources. Data will be available. Maybe there's a delay of about 3 months to give private sector the time to prepare for any negative reactions. We also have, if you work in a team, there's a critical team which is necessary for good science. They keep each other on track. And you can also, what we do in the Netherlands, have pooled funding where a private sector is pooling their funding, so to increase the distance between the researcher and the private sector. So it is clear that at the end it will come to the researcher to resist actually the pressure. But this pressure can be immense, I admit. So we have to resist this pressure because it's a threat to independency and freedom of academic work. So a second point, which is more important in my opinion, is the setting of the research agenda. And I think with the reducing of the government funds or public funds, we are more and more pushed to private sector funds, and you see that is influencing the research agenda. For example, more integrated projects are more difficult to be funded, especially by private sector, because the results cannot be attributed to a specific product, so that makes it less interesting for a private sector. A third issue, and that's then with my work on food systems for healthier diets, there's no way you are not working with the private sector, because they are the ones, and I agree it's heterogeneous, they are the ones that are actually providing the food to the population for which we would like to improve the diet. In that case, it's the other way around. We are not so much working with large food industries, we are working with SMEs. We are not yet very successful in that because it's difficult to get them involved in this type of programs. And one of the requests of SMEs is that they have no capital to mitigate the risk of investing in such new undertaking. And they're asking public sector to give money to the private sector to mitigate these risks. And then the question is, do we use public budget or public money to invest in the private sector? So these are the 3 points I would like to raise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me put it in the perspective of my country, Mexico. Mexico is a country that is dominated by non-communicable chronic disease. 70% of all adults have obesity or overweight. 1/3 of the children have obesity or overweight, and diabetes mellitus has just become the second cause of mortality in our country. This at the same time as we are one of the highest consumers of sugary beverages in the world, and our diet has become one of ultra-processed foods mostly. 70% of all of the sugar that we consume in the diet comes from ultra-processed foods. So in this context, during the last almost 20 years, we have been treating to identify ways to prevent and control these problems. The bad news for us is that the budget for health is decreasing every year. And it's not likely to increase or to achieve the recommendation of the OECD for our country. We are investing less than 2% of our gross national product in health, and in prevention is very little. So in this context, we are trying to implement some of the policies that we know are cost effective from the evidence around the world, such as soda taxes, front of pack labeling to improve, to make easier for the people to take healthier choices, improve the school environment to make it healthier, and also to regulate marketing to children. And in this process, what we have found is like a very complex situation in which industry implements very sophisticated ways to defend, delay, deny, divide all the policies that we are pushing, and some of the ways they do it are very well known, like with scholarships, grants, supporting social causes and things that improve their image, but also they have a much worse part of doing it with lobbying, and bribes, and also with very scary actions, such as in Mexico, probably some of you know that there was a case of spyware that is used against terrorism, and it was used against researchers in our institute and to advocates of the soda tax, and this came in the New York Times, but it's the kind of experience that we are having. So it's, we think in our experience, and this is a recommendation for countries that are becoming more, are following this transition, is to put at the center of the chronic disease policies, interference of industry and conflicts of interest as topics that needs to be documented, researched, and discussed in all the policies. And I think this is very necessary. This has been also commented and recognized by the Lancet series on the global pandemic as one of these feedback loops that will not allow progress on preventing these conditions.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm with the International Potato Center based in Nairobi, and what I'm bringing to the table here is to address this issue of the heterogeneous private sector. And I work with the biofortified sweet potato, which is very rich in vitamin A, and most of it in sub-Saharan Africa, 95% is consumed boiled or steamed, and that's excellent. But of course, we live in an urbanizing world, and historically, if we look at root and tuber data, the use of roots and tubers in urban areas drops off because they're bulky and costly to transport. So we've been working on the development of orange flesh sweet potato puree, the steamed and mashed puree. And so our focus has been on how do we get medium-scale enterprises to engage in puree production. And we targeted working on replacing 30 to 45% of the wheat flour in products with the puree. And again, when you're working in this kind of situation, you have two things in mind. You're trying to create markets for farmers, because any class of farmer can grow sweet potato. And in most sub-Saharan African countries, the vast majority of wheat flour is imported. So there's a win-win there on two sides. Now, because we're facing medium-scale enterprises, you know, they don't want to take many risks. They know what their markets are. So in this kind of condition, there's two things we have been focused on when we're looking for private sector partnerships. One, a private sector partner that does have a sense of social responsibility that's been demonstrated, whether because they've been engaged in helping set up schools in their community, or they've been willing to work with smallholder farmers, which is part of our mandate, looking for that kind of player. And two, you know, really willingness to share sales data and work together with us, because our perspective is we start with them with the products they're actually doing and see how we can incorporate in the orange flesh sweet potato puree as a functional ingredient. And so you're doing research with the private sector. So in this kind of case, they do expect, and I think it's reasonable for them to expect, some kind of subsidization of this process, helping to cover the costs of test marketing some of these new products. And we've been heavily engaged with them in doing the consumer acceptability research and helping them, certainly subsidizing and providing for them the nutrient analysis of the product, because we want to make sure that product has sufficient amounts of provitamin A in the product and the final product. So it is, I think, a partnership to get these things off the ground. I don't think we can assume for these medium-scale enterprises that they have all the funds to do it. But then the interesting conflict comes on the nutrition side, I think, in the sense that we know that fat and sugar taste good. So when we start out, particularly since we're working in the baked goods sector, in a particular case in which we did, the biscuit that the person is making already, which is highly successful, has a heck of a lot of sugar in it. So through the testing and the working with them, we were able to bring the additional sugar down quite a lot, but I won't say there's no sugar in the product. So in my perspective, we're working towards healthier products. These products aren't going to disappear from the market, but we're also looking at the sides of incomes for smallholders as well as improved nutritional content. And that sometimes gets negative feedback, principally from the nutrition community. Why aren't you only working on only healthy products? But I think we're seeing it requires demand creation and a lot of increased knowledge in the consumer sector to demand the healthy products. But in the interim, I think we can make considerable progress with healthier products. And so that is the sort of conundrum we're in, because we do want to create markets for smallholder farmers, and we do want to make healthier products. But I think it's going to take perhaps taxing the multinational industry and getting more money to do the education to help create that demand for the truly, purely healthy products.
Thank you. My name is Francis Zotor, and I would wear a lot of hats, and so I'm going to come from a different angle. I'm an academic with the university. I also am a trustee of the African Nutrition Society, and we organize conferences all over Africa. And what that means is that we try and get funding to support our young researchers and also young students so that they can attend our conferences to gain knowledge and to try to build capacity. Now, this is very important because how do we bring those young researchers and the students to our conferences? We've got to look for money from different sectors. Now, I also happen to serve on the International Union of Nutritional Sciences as a council member, as well as the academic platform of the Scaling Up Nutrition. Now, whatever I say here, and I issue this disclaimer, is not in an official capacity for Scaling Up Nutrition or for the IUNS or even for the African Nutrition Society. These are personal views based on my observations in what happens in the field of academic or in the field of nutrition where I am. Now, when we talk about funding, getting funding from the private sector, two things that come out clearly for me are issues to do with the conflict of interest and then whether it is ethical and unethical. Now, for the conflict of interest, what do I have to stand out there to do such that I do not project a statement in an official capacity that would jeopardize my organization? And would I also compromise my values in such a way that I would have personal gain? So with these two things that stand up in my mind, I've always guided myself, especially recently as part of the Scaling Up Nutrition academic platform, by a publication by Lai and Graham, which was published in the World Nutrition 2018, volume 9, number 1. And these have set certain guidelines that SAN has for the 49 countries that come from Africa that belong to Scaling Up Nutrition in terms of policies relating to getting funds from the private sector. Maybe it will be of interest to you to read that. World Nutrition 2018, volume 9, number 1. In looking at this, my take normally in looking for funding for young researchers has always been the conflict of whether I should go for money from the private sector to support young scientists. And it's been very hard sometimes. And I'll give you a clear example. There was a UN organization that wanted to fund a conference that we're hosting about 6 years ago, and they promised to give us $20,000 towards the conference. There was this other food industry that realized that we're struggling for funds. And so they said, okay, we'll come along and give you $5,000. When the UN organization got to know about it, they withdrew the $20,000. I was mad. $20,000 that would have brought students from across Africa to come and gain knowledge. But what we have since done is we set the ground rules for the private sector funding. And we're saying that you want to help us, that is fine. Now, these are our terms. And our terms are that we put the money in a basket fund and we would use it to support students so that they can come to conferences. Now, I churn out 50 nutritionists every year from my university alone. Some of them go to work in the private sector, and some of them work in the public sector. Now, for those who work in the private sector, in Coca-Cola, in Nestle, in Unilever, Danone, and they want to come to my conference, or for students who want to attend our conferences, what do I do in a situation like this? And I say, look, wherever you can get the money, as long as it's ethically right. I wouldn't go to some of those private organizations and then use it to run our programs. We would maybe use it to support students. So we have set the ground rules. Take it or leave it. And most often I look for organizations where there are no conflicts or where people would not raise eyebrows. And I know that seated here are several kinds of individuals who have got their own views about whether to take money from the private sector or not to. And we've got to be pragmatic about it. The reason I say this is look at Africa. It is a challenge to get funding to attend conferences in the West. It's also a challenge to get funding to organize conferences. That does not, however, mean that we take anything. It is true that we are the dumping ground for many things in Africa, but we also become the dumping ground in the case in issues to do with conflict of interest and things that are unethical. We have had to grapple with this all the time. And so in setting the ground rules, we try not to compromise our values. We try not to fall in a situation where we fall into disrepute with the scientific world. And this has always been the way we have navigated raising funds from the private sector. We need the private sector in the sense to come and work along with us so that together we can be able to move the nutrition agenda forward. And this has always been our stand, or my stand, when it comes to getting funds from the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. So there were excellent opening statements. Now let's probe them a little further and try and get our panelists to react to some of the statements made by the other panelists. So Inge, Simone said they've been hunted and haunted by the industry when they took certain positions. They were even called terrorists. Now, how would you deal with a situation like that, and what would be your advice? And secondly, is there some sort of an international solidarity among researchers that when such things happen, others everywhere in the world stand up and say, we support you?
To react to the last, I think there's not, let's say, a common solidarity. I think within the nutrition community, we are still discussing. So there's a group who is seeing private sector as the devil. And there are groups who are actually willing to work with private sector to change from within. The statements that you are making are really very strong, and I can imagine with the problematics you described in Mexico, that it will be very difficult to connect yourself as a researcher and your institute with such private sectors, because it will also reduce your credibility. And as I said, that's our most important characteristic that we have. So, but then my question is, how are you going to change these industries? An example from the Netherlands is from my year when I got my PhD. All of my colleagues went to Unilever to work. I was the only one that did not go there. So with the R&D, we could discuss and we could raise these things in discussion. But I think in Mexico, the distance is already so far that you cannot change within anymore. So you have to find other ways. But solidarity, I think, does not yet exist.
So Simone, Francis said they do try and identify partners who have shared values, but they also try and get them to contribute to a basket fund so that no single donor can actually dictate the terms. Could that kind of thing work in Mexico?
Well, I think these are the kind of things that we need to look to make it possible and to make it work. So I agree that there must be a model out there to help that these funds can reach the people that needs them without affecting their decisions. But what I was talking about, I think, is in the policy-making process, and that's the problem in Mexico. The problem in Mexico is that the companies want to be in the table planning the policies, for example, to reduce consumption of sugary beverages, and they represent Coca-Cola. So it doesn't make sense. Like everybody knows that word, the business of business is business. Well, their business is business. It doesn't matter that they say that they care about nutrition and about health. They don't want to lose revenue. So all the times that they have been sitting in the chair in the policy-making processes, the only result we have obtained is delaying, dividing, stopping the process, and no results. So I strongly think that we can listen to them. We can listen to the needs or challenges they face. They need to maintain their businesses, but we need healthier choices, and they need to be regulated. So my point is, they cannot be sitting in the decision-making tables.
Yeah, and Francis said that bringing young researchers to conferences and introducing them to the cutting edge of science and getting them to present papers is very difficult without private sector funding. Is that a major problem? And if so, how can we ensure that A, public sector steps in too, and B, that it does not bring in conditionalities along with the private sector funding? No, that's for you. I'm asking you to react to his comment.
I see. Well, we were actually swapping stories yesterday as we were preparing for the panel. I'm also raising money for a conference in August, and it's been extremely difficult to get it from the traditional partners because people are moving away. CTA, some of the other organizations that used to fund young researchers to come to conferences, they're moving away from that as a practice. So I've had to go more and more to the private sector, and in exchange, we often give them a speaking slot or something of that nature. And so I think it really does reflect the challenges that you face. And in this case, we're exchanging ideas and scientific knowledge and looking for the potential for private-public sector partnerships. So I see it as potentially a good thing, but then I'm very concerned on the other side of how difficult it is to get funds to sponsor these kinds of training opportunities or other opportunities that may have been easier to do in the past. And part of it is the changing nature of what's of interest to the donor community, and I understand that. But you want to maintain the community of practice groups that one has built and keep on that scientific exchange going. So I don't think there are many easy answers because a lot of the private sector partners want to see something tangible in real terms for them to participate in these kinds of endeavors. And we know that training opportunities and response to research does take time to produce results. And some of those results may not be positive to the private sector partner.
Francis, is Africa tomorrow going to be where Mexico is today? Or are you seeing yourself in a different space where you have very clear-cut institutional arrangements so that you can manage all of these relationships very well without actually compromising any of the values you spoke of?
Without a doubt, Africa is already where Mexico is, in the sense that I made earlier on statement that will become the dumping ground for a lot of products that is compromising the values of our people. And I say that because we see higher levels of obesity, overweight and obesity on the rise. We see various people trying to cut corners to be able to make it. And we see all of that going on constantly. Now, to bring up checks and balances so that we don't become I don't want to say Mexico, we don't become a situation where we have so much influx that they control, the industry or the private sector controls us. The way forward is to, yes, maintain a working relationship with them. In maintaining having that kind of working relationship with them, we can have some influence, and by doing that, we can kind of help them to minimize some of the things that are not of interest to the public. Because at the end of the day, whatever they bring in, is that going to harm the public? Is it of public interest? Is the government of the day interested in its people so that we do not allow the influx of certain things from the private sector that would affect us? And so constantly we've got to have this. We cannot keep them at arm's length. We've got to have a relationship with them. We've got to work with them so that we can work in harmony to come to try and find solutions. And until we begin to do that, there will be a challenge. And I say this just in closing my statement. 3 weeks ago, I was in Kenya, and I was having a chat with a very close friend of mine who manages a firm, a private industry. He said, look, we can give you $50,000 to support your conference next year. And I said, whoa. And she said, look, how many of you take Coca-Cola? I said, well, I don't take Coca-Cola, but if I take a poll right now, how many of you take Coca-Cola? Your hands should be down. We are creatures of habit. And so he says, now, if I want to support you for your conference to succeed, why are you refusing $50,000 to support young scientists? I said, I'm not refusing $50,000. You give me the money, I put it in a basket fund, and that way we can use it to support students. But we've also got to be conscious that at the end of the day, we've got to protect the public. The government has got to protect the public. We've got to look at the sugar content, we've got to look at the fat content in our foods. Is this good for our populace? How do we work with them? How do they do research or put money back into research to be able to reduce some of these levels that can be good for the populace? Unless we begin to do that, we'll end up in a situation where bad food comes in and people begin to go the other way around.
Thank you. So our panelists have been forthright in responding to many of the questions that I posed initially. Now it's your turn to direct your questions and comments. If you have any specific panelist in mind to respond to the question, please direct the question to that panelist. Otherwise, we will let the panelists choose who wishes to answer from among them. I guess there are roving microphones.
Really, to anyone on the panel, I just wonder, no one's mentioned the concept of corporate social responsibility and how you see how the big food companies have engaged to the level that we would like, where you see the opportunities, and how we could perhaps, as a community, stimulate, motivate them to become engaged, to see nutrition as a really great opportunity for them to engage in corporate social responsibility. Thanks.
Who would like to take it?
In my opinion, there are very few examples that you really go to corporate social responsibility or to the heart of the business collaboration in any of the food companies. So there are changes, but not to the particular products that are the problems. So I think it's very low level of corporate social responsibility that's, that's really touch on the business model of food companies. An example, for example, Unilever is doing a lot on sustainable sourcing, and they are quite successful in it, but they don't change their products. Their products are still on the market.
Okay. How are our nutrition policies shaped in such a way that it does not have undue influence from industries. And I believe that every industry would have a corporate social responsibility to the populace. What are your products doing to the populace? How are you plowing back your funds into research to try and look out for the good of the community in which you are working? And there has to be constantly this research from industry as part of their corporate social responsibility to try and engage in activities that would not affect the community, that would not affect the society, that would not affect the country. And so there is a win-win by government and industry to have at the back of their mind and right in front of them that as part of their corporate social responsibility, whatever we do should be ethical, whatever we do should be for the health of the community we are operating in. And once we understand the game rules, then everything that we do should be directed in that regard. Research and the products that you sell. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to have a government to spend so much money in trying to treat its own people through whatever you give out there. And that is the way I look at it in terms of our nutrition policies.
We've had several conversations with some of the big multinationals, and to date, they haven't gone very far because I think, as Inge said, what they engage in either has to be very high visibility, so it tends to be infrastructure, schools, supporting a football team, or something that aligns with the product that they're producing. So they have to see that the bottom line makes sense to them, that the use of your ingredient will actually help them make better profits. And that's why we go towards working with the medium-scale enterprises. And though they don't call it corporate responsibility, but you see it from what they're doing within their own communities. They tend to be more focused on how they have relationships with the people in their more immediate districts or local areas. And so that's how we do part of that partner identification. Or the other way we identify potential private sector partners is putting an advertisement in the paper, come learn about this new technology, and then we have people put in business plans and bid for the opportunity to work with us again, and saying, this will be the amount of support we can give you to take the risk to engage in this venture. So those are the two methods we've used, sort of going out and looking around and talking to various companies, talking to the community, see how they're perceived, and then doing the advertising approach where we see who comes to the table to learn about new opportunities. But to date, our greatest success has been at that medium range.
Well, I think that 99% of the actions of social responsibility of the multinational companies are marketing actions. Just to put examples, in Mexico, they engage 16,000 kids in sports, soccer tournaments, and everybody gets the T-shirt with the logo, and I think that's a marketing strategy that has nothing to do with social responsibility, but they use it, and they are talking with the Ministry of Education of how important is this, and the ministry is convinced of this. Tomorrow in Mexico is going to be discussed in the Senate the warning label initiative, the same warning labels that Chile has implemented, and in front of the Senate, the multinational companies put a permanent exhibition to take the senators there to see how they are recycling the soda bottles and all the goods that they are doing, because they are very socially responsible. And when they end the exhibition, they give them a key of the companies to every congressman, saying you can come whenever you want to our companies to see how committed are we to improve. So I think they are just doing this permanent exhibition to interfere in a very important policy that is front of pack labeling, to help people just making healthier decisions. We are not saying don't sell your unhealthy products, just let us tell the people what your product has. So I am very skeptical about the current efforts on, but I guess there are some things that can be done on social responsibility, and the true social responsibility maybe is the one that is not working for them for marketing, but really doing things good, maybe in a common basket on the government. And then maybe it's not social responsibility, maybe it's a tax on them to balance all the harm they are doing to health. So I don't know.
There's a hand up there. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much to the panelists for your comments today on the topic of engaging the private sector. I guess the sense we're getting is there's some fair amount of wariness of engaging with them, and I think the case you make about need for regulation is appropriate. You know, without a sugar tax, maybe Coca-Cola will always sell sugar, and some of the discussion was around private sector funding research, and that's a very public sector domain. So I wanted to get some comments from you all on engaging with the private sector in the domain where they can play a role in development. For example, technologies that are beneficial to smallholders, there should be a demand for it from smallholders because presumably they benefit them. So suppliers should be, private sector should be supplying them. And somehow that's not happening and market is failing. So is there a way to engage them positively in development? And I know that a lot of donors are seeking ways to engage the private sector, bring in their resources to those space. And one example is AgResults. It's a multi-donor funded program where, which is actually testing the use of challenges and prizes to incentivize the private sector to solve development problems, to increase adoption of technologies like AflaSafe or improved legume seeds or vitamin A maize. So just a comment on that, because I think we've been talking about private sector more in the context of big corporation and MNCs, but not to forget the traders and retailers who are also private sector and very vibrant part of, even very often, the beneficiaries of development programs. So I would appreciate some comments on that.
So the demand for technologies, the
Yes,
engagement of small
yeah.
traders, etc.
Yeah, like the private sector is an incredibly diverse group, and we do want to work closely with them, and particularly in terms of input delivery and things. And I think there's been some very interesting initiatives. I know in Kenya, I think the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa provided the guarantee behind starting for Equity Bank to start giving loans to smallholder farmers because they didn't want to take the risk. So they had a guarantor that enabled them to go out and start doing something that would enable getting some credit to farmers. I think those kinds of initiatives are the kind of thing you're talking about. And I think as some organizations, we provide a facilitation role. Oftentimes, it's working with the private sector in our value chain work as I think we're considered to be the honest broker. You know, working with them about how to engage and be willing. One of the challenges we have in sub-Saharan Africa when you're working with the private sector is the fact that in most countries a contract doesn't mean very much, right? It's an agreement, you sign it, but there's no way to enforce that contract. And so, you know, we go in and we try and say to the private sector partner, well, be willing to pay 10% or 5% above the going market price for these fresh fruits, or you're going to be besieged with side selling and you're going to be complaining that you can't work with these farmers because they aren't giving you the consistency of supply. You know, whereas a lot of companies really try and set a set price forever, and then they wonder why they aren't getting the deliveries that they need. So I think in working with the private sector, there's a lot of people often tell you work with the private sector because they know what they're doing, they have the distribution networks, et cetera, but you often find the private sector too is struggling to make a profit. A lot of these private sectors are operating in an enabling environment that's not very friendly to business, or the infrastructure is very poor. So I think we have, as we work with the private sector, I think we have to see that it actually does require, at times, some significant technical support and understanding among the different parties to get this to actually help smallholder farmers and to make sure we can penetrate urban markets.
In certain sectors, that holds. What Jan has said is perfectly right. In other sectors, engaging in technology, good as it may be, can also be a small screen. The bottom line is, how do you come up with a product that is healthy for the community or the country you are working in? And the way I see it is, that is the bottom line. I'll tell you a clear case. I'm glad you don't all know where I come from, which country I come from, but I happen to chair the FDA Technical Advisory Committee for Nutrition. And there was a product that was brought in front of us that was endorsed by our Nutrition Association, and it had only less than 7% tomato in it. And they gave it all kinds of names. What was the 93% or more containing, if they said this was a tomato product? And so what impact would it have on the populace many years later? Now, would I engage with that organization and say, look, what you are selling as tomato is not actually tomato. You've got a lot of starch, a lot of other ingredients in it that is not healthy for our people. How can we work together so that you can actually improve the tomato content? So how do companies, private sector, engage in research so that at the end of the day, the product that they sell is healthy for our people? Now, they can build stadiums, they can build sports arenas and whatever, but if they do not consciously work to reduce the content of their products, which is unhealthy for our people, then we will not be making any gains. Technology, yes, but what is that technology directed at in relation to their products? And this is something that I've always struggled with sometimes.
There's a question there.
So this question is for Inge, but perhaps others can answer as well. And my question is to Inge, because I know that Wageningen has been involved in joint appointments, right, between private sector and the university. And do you think this strategy works to kind of almost create a mutual understanding and perhaps a common strategy to move things forward?
Thanks for this, this question. Yes, we have quite some joint appointments. Also, some of the food companies are on the premises of our university. In my personal opinion is that probably that's not the best to do. What we have is TIFFN, which is a top institute of nutrition and food science, where we have this basket funding. And to me, it's better to increase the distance between the food companies and the researcher a bit more, and channel these kind of appointments through such a basket fund. I think that's healthier for the researcher, because most of these researchers are very young and they feel really the pressure and the criticism that they get working with these food companies. So that's, I think.
There's a question there, I think, and then one question at the back.
Hi, I'm Merush. My question is, with the changes in ODA globally, there's more emphasis on private sector donors now funding research. And most of this research is kind of almost focused on like technological innovations in food systems rather than a food systems approach to research. So I was wondering if the panel had any ideas on how to navigate that, and because the community over here always thinks about systems approaches to things and how we have kind of navigated those pressures from these donors to think about technology-focused innovations rather than systems approaches to these things.
Who would like to take that?
That's a tough one. You want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a tough one. As I indicated already earlier, it's more integrated, more complex researchers are difficult to get funded with private sector. But I think in the whole program where you work on food systems, certain parts can be funded that are specifically focused on a certain solving of a certain problem that private sector could solve with their knowledge. I don't think we should be too naive to think that we can give the responsibility for public health to private sector. They're just not, I mean, that's not their business, actually. We should govern that and let them do where they are very good in, but also have the opportunities to step out again and not become so dependent that you cannot do that anymore.
And I do think that's where everybody sort of looks and watches the Mexican experience in terms of taxation of the larger companies that are coming in, particularly with the Ultra Foods or other projects, and how then it's the question of when you do tax, where do those funds go? And how are those funds utilized either in nutrition education campaigns or demand creation campaigns, or setting up research funds that a separate independent committee would govern. But it's getting the political will to make that move forward. You were telling me it took you over 10 years to actually succeed. And in a place like some other countries, can we move that faster, either through having better engagements with regional institutions like the African Union or others that help speed up this process and give models to be followed, so it just doesn't disappear in the government coffers and we just have a tax that actually doesn't work towards the improvement of nutrition or providing research into things like food systems and other needed areas which are underfunded.
There's a hand right at the back, and then we'll take the last question from here.
Hi, Jodie Harris. So Jan has really usefully said that the private sector is many different things. It's everyone from a smallholder farmer to a multinational company. And I wonder if the panel could reflect on whether we need better language to talk about these issues in the private sector, and then whether we need different principles in order to work differently with these different levels.
Well, I think, yes, we need many principles. Like one principle that in the Latin American Society of Nutrition we put like the first recommendation is, if you don't need it, don't ask for it. So for example, that's something important. Also, transparency on the relationships. We in Mexico, for example, the National Pediatric Association has like 2 or 3 congresses per year that have more than 10,000 pediatricians, and they are, most of them, with scholarships from companies such as Nestle. So it's very difficult. We are one of the countries with the worst breastfeeding rates in America and in the world, and it's clearly a relation. So yes, we need rules to allow some kind of relation with companies. But I think the bottom line is you can talk with them, you can discuss ways to improve health, but they need to be regulated. And that's, so there are some solutions in health and in nutrition that need to be decided by experts free of conflicts of interest, and they need to comply with these decisions. They cannot be part of these discussions.
Last question from here.
If I can just follow up on that for 2 seconds.
Okay,
I think you're absolutely right. I think the terminology is very vague, and so people have to define it. And that's why I think this SME sort of terminology has come up for the smaller companies or agro-processors, multinational companies. But I think one of the biggest problems we have everywhere is, smallholder farmers, independent private sector farmers, often aren't organized and united, and they don't have a voice. And it's that lack of voice of that part of the private sector that's part of the problem too, because they can't advocate for their own needs effectively as a political force. And a lot of this goes outside the mandate of research organizations. So, again, where is that leadership going to emerge from and get stronger in the future?
Hello, Alan Dangor, London School of Hygiene. This is a contested space and we're navigating it. I think there's some excellent discussion here. It's far too important a topic to leave to a panel discussion at an annual conference. And I'm wondering whether you have examples from your own institutions or other institutions where this is being taught to nutrition students, so with frameworks and examples of success and failure, so that the generation of students have a much can take this a little bit further?
That's a good question to end on. Maybe 2 minutes per panelist to answer that question.
I can say something about it. Okay, one interesting example that we made for the first time last year is in the Latin American Society of Nutrition. The Latin American region is very sensitive to this industry interference because it has been present in Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Peru. And all these countries have been attempting to implement obesity prevention policies. So in the Latin American Congress, we decided to make it free of industry sponsorship, which is very different to what we are used to see in the US, in the IONS, in the American Society of Nutrition that are with scholarships from Coca-Cola, Nestle, etc. And it was very formative for the students, and you could follow that. We measure tweets and impact of this on opinions, and it was very important. There are in Chile, they are very advanced. They have physicians without brands, which is an association, and also nutritionists without brands. In Mexico, it's starting, but they are now very sensitive. Obviously, in Brazil also. But I think this effort needs to be replicated in other regions. It's possible. We are not a rich region or a developed region, and we were able to do it with support of international agencies or local government and local producers, and it was possible to keep multinational companies out.
Yes, I would say this is a very important topic that we need to really look at, and I have often mentioned this to my students in saying that how do you react when somebody comes to you and dangles a bait before you? How do you react with it? And John has talked about the heterogeneous nature of the private sector. It is important to try and explore other avenues of funding other than the private sector. But in engaging with the private sector, the important thing for me is to try and maintain a working relationship with them, try to have an ongoing dialogue with them, but also try, by having that ongoing dialogue with them, you might end up neutralizing some of the issues that they have so that you would be able to look at things that relate to public interest. That should be things that we should always explore. Else, I mean, private sector are not demons. They are in our society. And we work, and they are there to make profit. But at the end of the day, how do we work in harmony with them so that we can ultimately provide health for our people?
Can I?
How do you train young researchers?
Yes, so to react on your question, I think it's an important statement also. In our institute, we do have courses on ethics of science, where this is working together with private sector is part of. But in my time, when I was a student, it was obligatory, but now it's not. So it's a voluntary choice of students to follow it. And I think I agree with you, that's actually a pity, yes.
Any comment?
Well, I'm not in a university, but I work in a country where there's very high unemployment. People want jobs. And I think that is the reality that you're looking with. If it's a job in a company that makes a product that's unhealthy and the person gets a paycheck, why on earth would they turn it down? I think we're being unrealistic to think that people will not take jobs when they desperately need jobs. And so that's where I think leadership, moral leadership, we need stronger governments with that leadership and regulation, because you can't expect young people to go hungry. And right now there are just, when you look at the need for jobs and the lack of jobs, that's why these companies have such an influence they do in these countries, because they're bringing in jobs. And the government says, well, it's jobs. And that's the dilemma we're in, and that's why it's going to take a lot of very creative thinking, and I think pretty heavy sticks and regulation to make these, to prevent the model from spreading everywhere.
Thank you. So you have another comment now? So let me try and sum up what has been a very rich discussion. But let me start by saying that we are living now in the era of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that I say for two reasons. One, of course, is the big challenge of ensuring that our agriculture and food systems are now much more environmentally friendly, that they do not damage the environment. At the same time, they also are climate smart and climate resilient so that they can also withstand some of the environmental degradation that's happening because of other reasons. So when the SDGs talk of our common future, we are not talking in fragmented senses of certain food products or select industries. We are talking about our common odyssey towards an ecologically and economically sustainable future. The other reason I'm raising the SDGs is that the Sustainable Development Goal 17 talks of partnerships, because we are in it all together. So we have to really ensure that all of society's resources are brought together for the common good of everybody on this planet. And that includes also all sections of the industry as well. Though the clear-cut interests that each section brings and the potential conflicts there exist and the pathways for achieving common good all will have to be carefully considered and acted upon. And for that, the usual term that's used is PPP, Partnership for Public-Private Partnership. But I would rather rephrase it as Partnership for Public Purpose. Define the public purpose, define the deliverables, define the accountability mechanisms, and define the common good that will come out of it, and ensure that it's adequately monitored by the government, by the private sector itself, and by a vigilant civil society. Now, of course, in all this, we need to protect the credibility of science, as our panelists have pointed out. And if we do engage, we engage on the basis of shared values. So that is an important message, again, that has come out. But we also have recognized that we do require different instruments to ensure that this process is both protected and productive. And for that, when we look at what is the reigning deity of the day, the market, we must recognize that the market cannot be an autonomous entity. It has to be sensitive and aligned to the larger interests of health and nutrition of the global community for the common good, as I said. And for that, we need to also use research to propel different areas which can influence the market. Consumer consciousness, on one hand. How do we ensure consumer behavior sets the right kind of demand? How do we ensure that the private sector recognizes both the health and economic dividend of shifting to new products which are healthier? How do we bring in the right regulatory instruments in terms of financial incentives and disincentives or regulations at the national level, which can actually move the private sector in the right direction and incentivize healthier products and disincentivize unhealthy products? How do we bring about global agreements, something on the lines of the Tobacco Treaty, or even ensuring that free trade agreements do not undermine the health goals? Again, that requires a different kind of research. So the researchers have a great responsibility in bringing all of this information together. In fact, government policy, which has been talked about in terms of regulation and incentives, is both the carrot and the stick. I call it a frozen carrot, which can be both a carrot and a stick. So we need to use that fairly judiciously. And finally, as to the advice to the young researchers, which has been Alan's question, and which our panelists have very well answered, I'll only go back to what Louis Pasteur told his own young researchers: keep your enthusiasm, but let strict verification be its constant companion. Thank you.